turn it over to Eric for the introduction.
Thanks, John, and welcome everyone. This afternoon's Geospatial Forum presentation. It's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this week, who is Geri Miller. Geri is the director of the education sector at Esri, where her role is to support academic institutions and help them stay on the cutting edge of geospatial technologies. I know our programs have benefited a lot from our collaborations with Geri and with Esri over the years. Prior to that, she was an instructor and technical lead at Esri, specializing in online and on-site delivery of geospatial technology courses. She's also the associate program director at Johns Hopkins in their Master of Science in GIS program, and she's been a lecturer in that program since its inception. She's also developed and taught a range of courses across the GIS spectrum, including web GIS, spatial analytics, and programming and GIS courses. And today, Geri is going to be talking to us a little bit about geospatial education in the cloud and how that's related to advances in today's GIS workforce skills. And so please join me in welcoming Geri. And Geri, I will turn it over to you.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you, Eric, for the great introduction, and thank you everyone for welcoming me. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with you today. So as Eric mentioned, I kind of have a dual role, and I've been doing this for quite a bit of time. My main role is at Esri to lead the education team, and also I've been a part of Hopkins for quite some time now. I still teach there very much. I still do some administrative things like student advising, admissions, and curriculum development, and so on. So very much sort of a dual hat, but the two roles very much complement each other in a sense. And what I'll share today is a little bit of a perspective kind of from both points of view in a sense. And of course, a little bit of the talk and the discussion, it's going to be geared towards students. There are many students here on the line, and obviously some snippets for faculty and staff and such. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about is how geospatial education has changed, and what does that mean for today's workforce skills, and what are some of the things that we're still observing that are happening, or some things that are not necessarily happening out there. So before I dive into the specific topic, again, just to kind of talk a little bit about kind of where I came from, and maybe some of that has influenced some of those kind of career choices that I've made. But I originally grew up in Bulgaria and Eastern Europe, a while back. Even some of it, the first, second grade was a little bit more like kind of communist era style. But I finished high school there, and I moved to the US as an international student, and very pretty typical international student sort of career, and trying to figure out, obviously, new country, trying to figure out how to make do, how to pay for education and all of that stuff. And throughout all of those years, it was phenomenal just to see the support of the faculty, support of the staff, the encouragement that was there as part of the institutional system, and the institutions that I attended in particular. And it's always inspired me. So that kind of set me on this career track focused on education, where to me, even still very much as part of whatever role that is, what is inspiration to me is when I'm able to either help students succeed or help them get careers and so on. And that dictates a lot of what I do at Esri, and obviously as well as Johns Hopkins. So also just a little bit of a snippet sort of the pathway. And like I mentioned, there's kind of both of these things at Esri as well as Johns Hopkins that I do. I've taught at a couple of other universities, some of them while working on masters or working on PhD. But the one I think I wanted to mention, and it's going to tie into some of the parts of my talk, is that I went to Drexel University for an undergrad in business, and at the time at Drexel, there was no GIS in business, right? So it was there was no such classes, and just in the institution in general, but just reading National Geographic, I kind of got interested. So then I started looking around to see what other programs are doing GIS at the time. And again, you're talking 20 years or so ago. And OSU, so Oregon State University. Some of you might know Dr. Dawn Wright. She used to head a lot of their programs. She's a phenomenal educator, a very inspirational person. She is a chief scientist now at Esri, but she was at the time, those 20 some years ago, she helped launch one of the very first online GIS classes. So while I was kind of working on this business degree, I kind of looked, okay, well, what is this? So I took the classes. I took one class, I kind of liked it. I took another online class, and that combination sort of got me the job at Esri. Essentially, it was a very entry-level job. It was an inside sales job, a little bit of business, a little bit of GIS. But the point of it is some of that exploration, if you will, or some of that curiosity is sort of what helped, at least personally for me, start this career. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of, that sort of exploration side of things. But also before that, just think a little bit of why GIS. So we all know, everyone that is here, I'm assuming everyone knows what GIS is, what geospatial technology is. We all know that it is applicable and to so many different disciplines. We can do urban planning, urban decision making, state, city, federal, local government, all kinds of government entities and positions. We can do biodiversity, we can do medical sciences, geology, you name it. Pretty much any field out there can leverage just this geospatial technologies. There's so many different directions that we can go into. And as part of that, there are more so from a sort of a thinking back to my days as a student, from a student perspective, I'm going to quote one of my colleagues. Some of you might know him. I know, Jeff Essick, and some others might know Joseph Kursky. I like a line that he uses, and he's also wonderful educator. We've given career talks and such. So he said, when you think about a job and what you want to do in life, so that is an advice to students, just obviously get something that you're not looking at the clock and you're thinking like, is it 5 o'clock yet? And ready to be out of here. Can I go? But obviously think about doing something that is truly inspires you, inspirational, that helps us transform and change society. And particularly when we're thinking about geospatial technology, that is applying technology to solve problems, to be change agents in this world that we live in, because obviously we've got lots and lots and lots of problems at our hands that we can tackle. So in terms of what is very much inspirational and motivational, hopefully this is it. So be a change agent, be some part of something that can make and facilitate change, gain marketable skills. That's sort of another incentive. And ultimately, obviously, as students, we're very much interested in getting a job, right? So that's kind of one of the things that why we're doing it. But hopefully it's sort of a combination of these things, and specifically this first one. So I want to, before we go into some of the skills that we're seeing, I want to talk a little bit about industry trends and some things that are sort of foundational principles or changes in the industry that have happened. And for a lot of this, it's so as I mentioned earlier, and I've worked extensively with Eric and with Bill and with others at NC State. So fortunately, this is not necessarily something that that is applicable in NC State, but we're seeing it at many other places. And it's still taking a little bit of time to sort of adjust to this new paradigm of technology. So thinking back to time travel, 2004. So that's when Facebook was founded. That is how old the typical undergraduate student was, so about 3 years old or so. And our phones looked like this. So that's when this desktop technology was launched, right? So this sort of ArcMap, little older clunky looking thing, was launched 17 years ago. And technology has changed tremendously since then. Just the monumental impact of these changes have been just significant, right? So, and along these lines, some of this kind of the old era of things have been a little bit more kind of in this desktop world, if you will, where we had to go to the office or to the lab necessarily. We might still have to do that, but we had to go there to do work, right? When we're thinking about GIS applications, they're very complex. They're very kind of, took so much time to actually build them. And there are very few specialized GIS experts. And sort of the hands of the GIS technology was in these experts' hands. We worked on, some of you might remember, Arcgis workstation. I don't know, but these, again, complex workstations that had to be set up to do some of this work. And this world is no more. So things have changed tremendously, where pretty much anyone can do GIS. Anyone can do GIS on any device, right? Anyone can build applications that are lightweight, that are quick to build, that fulfill a specific purpose. And beautifully, we can do this anywhere. We can work, we can study anywhere. And some of these trends, of course, have affected what GIS looks like today. And again, kind of what some of these skills that these employers are expecting. So GIS today, field GIS, right? So GIS running on on mobile devices, lots of apps, whether it's dashboards, whether it's story maps, whether it's different kinds of web apps, lots of applications. Arcgis Pro, or if we're thinking about still a desktop application, particularly obviously just by association talking about an Esri platform, Arcgis Pro still being very much sort of part of this GIS today pattern as a desktop technology, but it's not just that, right? There's all these other things. And the point of it is this Pro application is sort of connected to the outside world. You can publish, you can share, you can do things with it online, and still has a lot of these robust tools and functionality. So what we call this sort of new GIS, we like to call it modern GIS. We still call it web GIS, whether it's cloud GIS, SaaS GIS, your favorite name. The point of it is it's not just desktop GIS only. There's again a lot of these sort of applications that are out there that are a little bit more applicable, and a lot of it is cloud-based. And often, especially in the COVID days, especially when we had to relocate and move remote, we actually saw a lot of sort of transition to just some of the geospatial work to be cloud-based or to be online-based. And a lot of course, we keep hearing things anymore, things like big data, working with big data, 3D imagery. A lot of that can now be cloud-based as well, which is just wonderful. That one needs for some of these capabilities is a browser, right? So for me, and this is more so again when I think about even from my sort of Hopkins side and umbrella. So why do some of these industry trends matter, right? So as an educational institutions, why is this important, right? So or when students look at an educational institution, why do these trends matter? Obviously, what attracts the students? So dynamic curriculum, cutting edge technology, innovation, of course, lots of opportunities, whether it's employment wise or else, and of course, diversity of faculty experiences. So those things said, when we think about some of these today's workforce skills, again, looking, evaluating at different employers, what are some of the things that we need? So when we think about it, have these changes in GIS really had a dramatic impact on the skills that are required for today's workforce? Hopefully, right? So hopefully we would hope that is the case. A couple of quotes from former students now that are recently employed, and some of them have indeed signified that they've kind of been taught on this desktop technology, whether it's ArcMap or solely desktop QGIS, but then they kind of had to learn on the job sort of thing, which is from one perspective, obviously would have been kind of great that they kind of walk in the workforce already knowing some of these newer trends and newer technologies. In some cases, we're always learning that, the focus is away from the tools and the buttons. We have to adapt easily, right? Also from more so employers' perspective and how things have changed in terms of how data is represented. So this is Jason Jackson, Bass Pro Shop quote. So the beauty of dashboarding tools is that they help people visualize something that can be complex, right? So long gone are the days of spreadsheets or these robust kind of clunky ways of trying to visualize our data or do analytics of our data. So again, lots of technology, modern technology that helps us do that. And then another point here, not very long ago, people wanted maps, they had to go to some other special department. That's also a trend that has changed. Now anyone can do this geospatial technology. And thinking back to some of these skills that are required, so what are some of them? So when we think about just kind of broader buckets, right? Things like application configuration. And really what we mean by this, it kind of sounds complex, but it's all of these apps, right? Whether it's field apps, whether it's mobile apps or web-based apps, they're agile, they're mobile friendly, they're easy to configure, they're quick. So that's a skill that's definitely sought by after employers. Automation, of course, it's always going to be there. Whether it's more so looking at specific workflow automation or specific task automation or specific visualization or map making or more the AI side of things automation, that's also very much a desired skill that is out there. For a little more JS-centric, JS-heavy jobs, of course, enterprise clouds, administration and management. So we're seeing some of that, or a lot of that, employers are looking for that as well. And last but not least, a little more the soft side of things, the requirements gathering, the, obviously communication skills, but also really truly being able to understand the problem and kind of thinking through that problem and how that problem can be solved with technology. So what are some of these business and technical considerations that would go into that? So a perfect example, so we all have seen this map, right? So the COVID map, the Hopkins map from cholera to COVID. When we think back to John Snow and how he studied cholera, in a sense that obviously it's kind of similar instances, right? So he was able to visualize and kind of use maps to figure out this pattern and to figure out where things are coming from or what the source of a disease is, in a sense. So thinking back to the dashboard and thinking back to these specific skills, to build a dashboard like this, so pretty much all of them are there, right? So all of them are required. So some app configuration, so these guys that put their heads together and build it, they use this dashboard app, right? Also, there's a lot of automation that went into it. So there's a lot of people had to grab data from all of these different sources to stitch this data together, put it in a specific format to actually feed it to the dashboard. So a lot of that had to be automated as well. So that's kind of the second bucket here. More so the enterprise and the cloud sort of administration, even for something like this, to anticipate the millions and millions of hits a second that it got, to be able to handle this load, there's a lot of sort of work that went into that. And of course, there's lots of other examples, but specifically thinking to this dashboard. And yes, lots of some of these other business, technical, and other requirements and things that had to be decided to build this dashboard. So along with that, some of these skills that are out there, so obviously understanding some of these apps, whether it's dashboards, story maps, understanding scripting, right? So Python is big, JavaScript as well, or web development, other things. These are just excerpts from recent job ads that are out there of what is it that these employers are looking for. A little bit more, again, sort of from an Esri aspect, Arcgis Pro, whether it's our enterprise, some of the business requirements of things, Arcgis Online, lots and lots and lots of that, and mobile apps, web apps, and so on. So those are sort of more the technical bucket skills, if you will. And again, one of the, we'll talk a little bit about, it's not just about the technology itself, right? It's also the adaptability. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but there's this other sort of set of skills that are also very important. The curiosity, right? So be curious, explore, experiment. This is the time to do it. Understanding how to use data, right? There's data comes at us from all different sources, all different directions, figuring out how to make sense of it, how to understand it. Know these geotechnical foundations that are there and be adaptable. It's an important part, but again, not to focus on, specific technology like Esri or other technologies that are out there, but the notion of being able to learn and to adapt, because if it's looking like something these days or today, it's going to be very different obviously years from now. So be able to constantly learn. So we're not like, obviously, like this old computer holding the door to something, but being able to change, be able to learn, to adapt, to be proactive, and of course, be a good communicator as well. So those are the things that we're seeing as we're having these conversations with employers of what is it that they're looking for from students, from recent graduates. And when we think about areas of JAS growth, it's two big broad buckets that we can kind of conceptualize them. So one is very much JAS jobs. So those are the geospatial focused, obviously, jobs and opportunities. So obviously JS technician, JS analyst, JS manager, JS programmer, or other kinds of geospatial focused jobs. And then there's all these jobs out there where JS it's not the sole focus, right? It could be anything, but it's a fundamental sort of tool on your tool belt, fundamental technology that we can use to solve these problems. And we're seeing tremendous growth in this area over here. It's sort of a big incentive for employers, when even if it's some other sort of job, to actually have some of this as a skill set to be able to take on certain kinds of employment. So again, more JS centric, and area where the JS is not the sole or the only focus. And that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of this growth. So lots and lots of opportunities. And something that I mentioned earlier is there's so many professions that are out there where GIS can be applicable to. So you see it here, there's tons and tons and tons of different spaces, from obviously industry, various kinds of industry, to government, academia and such. So lots of opportunities that are out there. Something else, and I'm sure you likely have heard this already, but when it comes to either skills or sort of be able to reach out to employers, to stand out in the eyes of employers, it's always a good idea to have some sort of a digital representation of your CV. A story map is always a wonderful choice, sort of like a living, breathing document that can keep current, that can be viewed on many different devices. It really can speak a lot. And also, speaking from sort of Esri hiring perspective, we look at them a lot whenever is it that we're hiring across different teams there. So they could help enhance some of the candidacy for a specific job or specific employment. And of course, other things, a lot of them are common sense, but they are important to always kind of continue to think about things like doing your homework on the desired organization. And of course, thinking about what can you bring to that specific organization, to that specific job. And I'll post, there are a couple of just wonderful examples of CVs, and I'll post a couple of them in a chat pod that chat here. So I'm going to copy and paste this and put it over. So again, just as an example of what sort of a GIS portfolio could look like, that could speak well in terms of potential employment. So sort of to start wrapping things up, there are lots of different changes, right? So GIS has transformed in many, many, many different ways since all those days that they're long gone. And when we think about employers, some employers, they have shifted over, right? So they have made this shift to this newer GIS patterns that we were just talking about. Some haven't. But even for those that have not, we're hearing, okay, well, I'd like to kind of bring someone on board that is up on some of these latest and greatest technology skills. And in terms of this transformation, again, some of these things, it's kind of one big ecosystem of things. It's lots of stuff, right? Some of the traditional functions of GIS, like mapping and visualization and analysis, and that stuff has not changed. We've been able to do this for years upon years, even 20 years ago. But how we do it, and the change in the technology shift and what is now available to us in terms of data, real-time tracking, and all of these, some of these other methods and mechanisms, when we think about GeoI, those are things that are that have changed, and there are kind of valuable things that that we can do, we could do, that we could put on our CVs. And lots of learning resources, again, obviously coming from Esri, mentioned some of these, you might know them, but again, regardless of what technology are you using, keep up, keep current, and that's really the key thing there, because that is something that is extremely valuable. So speaking of Esri, there's lots of learning lessons, tutorials, materials. Even if something is obviously not taught in a class, one can go out, explore. Lots of things that are geared and catered to specifically students, obviously to faculty and staff, and those teaching, those doing research and such. So lots of sort of supplemental materials that to help us keep current with some of this technology. And then sometimes not necessarily even for teaching, to kind of write things or spend tremendous amount of time updating content and updating materials. So with that, again, I kind of want to wrap up a little bit with just thinking about that sort of notion of a change agent. It's to be inspired to do something and to make a difference, and regardless of what area of field you are, and particularly using technology to solve problems, and gaining marketable skills. And of course, a lot of it is leveraging technology as something that we have in our tool belt to be able to help us get a job, to be able to help us talk to employers and make ourselves marketable. So with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing, and hopefully we can have some a discussion, and any questions that come up, feel free to chat in the chat. We'll read the questions out loud and address them, or feel free to just unmute and speak as well. That's always lovely too, to hear voices. So with that, I'll pause there for a second. And yeah, if you guys have any comments, any questions, hopefully you got some snippets and bits and pieces of info that were valuable.
Hey,
Yeah,
Geri.
everyone
It's
is out.
Bill.
Hey, Bill.
I've got a quick question for you. Well, I think it's quick anyway.
Sure.
Excuse me. You've talked about all these skills, and on the forum today, we all know how diverse this technology really is. And I have noticed that some folks will seem to focus on a particular technology, be it on working with developing mobile apps and native mobile apps, so it works on specifically Android or an iOS device or something of that nature. So you have the native OS. So you kind of have that back end systems person, and you also have the GIS practitioner, the person that does a lot of the analytics and can actually do a lot of the data development. If you had to focus on a technology or a way to go to develop some of these skills, where would you go first?
Oh, that's a great question, Bill. And I don't know if it's a short one. It can go in many different directions, right? And depends on a number of different things. To me, so if one is to look at more so broader applications, right? Or just broader applicability, broader opportunities, if you will, maybe more so the sort of the GIS analyst kind of track would be the way to go. But all that said, there are a lot of opportunities specifically for obviously programming mobile devices and such. It's just a little bit, to me, as I see those two different sort of areas or domains, there are, you know, one is a little bit broader, one is a little bit more niche. And in certain instances, the broader can be helpful and help you hire, but often the niche one can do that as well, because again, those are skills that are needed. And I know that kind of, you know, provides a wishy-washy answer, but but in a sense, it's difficult, right? So in many instances, probably the safer bet is the broader way to go. But if passion, skills, inclination, and so it's going more towards that very strong focus, maybe that's an opportunity to pursue as well. And it could very much be a sort of a leading source also of employment. And even if the passion and skills is not there, still having some of those programming skills are very, very, very important. Okay.
No, thank you. I get questions in my courses from students about where do I go from here? So that helps me guide them. Thank you, Geri.
Yep. All right. So looks like a couple of messages came in the chat. I'm gonna read them out loud. This was great. I work in public health and use GIS in my toolbox all the time. Wonderful. I teach open source GIS, but use Esri for my work. Certainly. And again, it's not one or the other. Often it's important to kind of have that breadth of, you know, technology exposure, right? So that's something that, you know, it would not be a good idea to be either one or the other, as long as there's obviously presence of all of these various technologies or of both of them. It is important. And ultimately, again, what employers are looking for could be either. But again, a little bit biased here with the Esri hat, but it is important to have those skills because they are helping hire. Hiring to jobs, right? So Vanessa says, I'm going to read the comment there. Academic experience X work experience. Does academic experience count when applying for a job? Oh, absolutely. I would think that it counts a lot. It's anything that you do in your academic career, whether it's through coursework, whether it's highlighting work that you have done on projects and courses. And again, if you want to focus on specific technologies, that all is extremely, extremely valuable. And I don't know if the question is specifically, I guess, okay, maybe I misunderstood the question a bit. Does it count as work experience? Answers could vary, and some of the other faculty here, I don't know if Eric or Bill or some of the others want to jump in on this with an opinion too, but to me, obviously it depends. Like if you're thinking of if there's either a specific internship that is part of that academic experience, then absolutely. If it is more so a specific project that you're working on, then certainly. But if it's just coursework, typically it's not. And I don't know if that helped answer the question, but along those lines, again, if it's important to emphasize any of your academic experience that you have had, right? Whether it's you're putting on CV or whoever. Now, whether that's counted as years of experience, it just depends on what that is, really.
So I think we had a hand raised. Yeah.
Hi. So thanks. That was a really great talk, Geri. So I sort of had a question about in terms of like after graduation and the potential for not having access to things like ArcGIS Pro anymore. Do you know if the Esri modules are still available to complete? So say you graduate, you don't find a job right away, but you want to still develop your skills for a specific job. Do you know if they're still available to complete?
So there are a couple of different options. So through the Learn ArcGIS website and program, so you can log in, but the duration of that account is a little bit short, so probably not really what you're looking for. There are some things that are free and some things that are not. One of the things, if you're in that situation, and I don't know how long NC State sort of allows post-graduation to have certain access. Universities typically do it between the order of 2 weeks to 6 months. It can kind of span anywhere there. But one thing to consider in your particular case, if you want to keep current, is there is, particularly for Esri, there's something called ArcGIS for personal use. It's $100. $100 is a lot, but if that's something that you can invest in outside of going the short duration, through Learn, only a couple of months sort of access. This is 1 year and you get access to pretty much all the technology, ArcGIS Online, all the apps and ArcGIS Pro and so on and so on. So for $100 to have the whole stack, to be able to keep those skills current, if it is a possibility from a financial perspective, I would say that that's the way to go. And of course, all these other resources that are there with Learn lessons and Esri training and all of that stuff, then you'll be able to do them sort of on your own.
Great, thanks.
Yep, you're welcome.
Geri, just to kind of follow up on maybe a similar question, but from a faculty perspective, we also need to try to stay as current as we can. And oftentimes we're learning some of the new stuff at the same time that students are learning the new stuff. And so I'm just curious, if you have thoughts on putting on your faculty hat, how you stay current and how you, at the same time, try to keep the students current while you're also trying to be current.
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric. And as faculty, we're faced with it again with some of these changes that are going on. There's no way that we're not wondering and faced with that all the time. To me, honestly, at some point, I accepted the fact that I'll either be pretty much at a similar pace of where students are, or only a little bit ahead of them, right? And there is, in educational institutions, we're sources of truth, right? So we're there to learn, and even if assigning something, I mean, obviously, doing something, trying to understand new technology, it's time intensive. Ideally, we do it ourselves, right? Try to understand it, and then we either share it or present it to our students. Honestly, anymore, I have seen nothing wrong with concurrently sort of exploring whatever is it that new technology is, or even, again, with some of these resources that are out there, whether it's Learn Lessons or other company documentation that has a tutorial somewhere, to ask students to just go in and explore, and then obviously try to reproduce that. Or if the workflow is, we're looking at the workflow, so that's the workflow that we're teaching or whatever topics that we're covering, and there happens to be some sort of supplementary tutorial associated with that. Of course, they can always go in and do it, even if I haven't done it myself. But then obviously asked and tasked to do something in addition to that. So in other words, it's hard. It's hard to always stay ahead. I mean, in certain instances we can do it, and in others we can't. I think it is okay to accept the fact that, to me at least, that we may not be as much ahead, but we can be working through all of these things sort of together, right? And then it's more of a collaborative environment. This specifically is when it comes to teaching, right? In the classroom itself. So I don't know if that helped as an idea or constellation, or maybe, That's a horrible approach, Geri.
It's always good to hear when, I mean, yeah, it's I think hard for us sometimes to even like simple things, deciding when do we sort of allow our students to use the newest release of something, especially if there's a significant change and we haven't vetted it ourselves enough, and things like that. And so sometimes it's I mean, it's seen as kind of a kind of constant catch-up game, I feel like.
Sure.
But and at some point you have to have a curriculum that can be adaptable, but it also that is not so much constantly changing that the degree from 1 year ago is not the same as the degree from this year. So it's a very kind of difficult balance sometimes in technology fields in general, not just GIS.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah. It very much is. And, and of course, depends on the technology too, right? And when I said to sort of kind of be just a little bit ahead of students, we can do it with certain things. We cannot do it with other things. Like you guys have thought about teaching with Arcgis Enterprise and such. That's not something that you just dive right into, right? It's just not. It's not something you have to kind of test. You have to figure out. You have to make sure that it works. And then obviously that's when the students can come in and follow certain projects, certain workflow. But there are other things like, dashboards or configurable apps or those kinds of more simple things that, again, there are some already resources that either exist somewhere that could be leveraged. Those are the things that I was just saying in a sense that maybe it's a little bit more forgiving when there's something that's out there that's tested, that's relatively easy to configure and to do, and then to explore in a class and to dedicate some time to actually truly just collaboratively work on it and explore technology. So it's a balance, right?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks.
Yep.
I think we had a chat too that came in.
Okay. All right. So let's see, a couple of chats. Says he has great MOOCs. Jeff Essick mentions, thank you very much. Very informative and helpful. Okay. And then Alberto asks, awesome presentation, thanks. Thanks. Regarding the GIS portfolio service, is it necessary to pay for it or can we make it with our own Esri accounts? So Alberto, I'm assuming that you mean the story map sample CVs that I shared. And you don't have to pay for it as long as you have an Arcgis account. And as long as you're an NC State student, then you should have an Arcgis account. And if not, you can ask Eric and Bill and Jeff and others that can help with that. But there's no service, it's free. It's using a technology called Story Map, an application called Story Maps. It's one of those other things that, again, it's sort of relatively intuitive to pick up, to experiment with and to explore with.
There's an earlier chat question from Stacy. Which would you predict will increase at a higher rate over the next 5 years, the dedicated GIS jobs or the jobs that use GIS as one of the tools in the toolbox?
It's a wonderful question. I actually think the latter, the GIS, the jobs that use GIS as a tools in the toolbox. I think the first one will stay very stable and consistent. It's the GIS jobs, they're not going to go away. That is the GIS focused jobs. They're not going away. We're seeing growth in those as well. So there will be growth, but the more exponential potential, in a sense, stands in some of these other, fields and disciplines, and just also pursuing careers by, obviously what's the majority of you, I'm assuming you are in a GIS-centric job program, right? So which is fantastic, right? So those kinds of GIS-centric jobs after graduation, they're not going to run away. They're always going to be there. There's always growth, but there's a lot of growth in positions that are just using GIS as a tool among many other things, right? So we see a lot more growth in those. At least to me, in the next 5 years, that's where a lot of the growth lies. And that's a wonderful question, Stacy.
Thanks. Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Which would be, if you see more potential growth for those type of jobs, would you what other skill set do you think pairs really well to make a person competitive for those type of jobs?
That's a great question. So often it depends on the domain expertise, right? So whether one is a geologist that has a GIS tool set, obviously geology skill set will be important, or a communications major that has a GIS skill set, that would be important as well, or the business major that has a GIS skill set. So those pairings for specific jobs, or environmental sciences major applying for environmental jobs that know GIS, it's a great pairing as well. So those, whatever is it, the domain expertise is paired with GIS, right? So that's an important part, right? As to other things that are more kind of general, applicable to other sort of fields, it's a good question. A lot we're seeing on some of those, the soft skills, the communication skills, if you will, the presentation skills, if you will, that obviously being comfortable to engage, be part of a team, interact with people, present and such. So maybe that is another area that sort of universally applies across all of these different disciplines. But still, to me, it's very important to kind of pair the area of expertise or area of interest, and then just using that geospatial tool set to supplement some of that.
Thank you.
Yep.
So we had another question in the chat. I'll just read it to you. Do you have any recommendations for international students looking for jobs at Esri or elsewhere as a GIS analyst or developer?
Yeah, so I'll share a website that basically Esri has quite a few programs for internships, for assistantships as well, and basically with career services. And let me go ahead and back to the Zoom meeting. Sorry, I lost the Zoom window. There it is. So I'll share that. So the advice there is there are basically a few of these opportunities that are there. So specifically speaking for Esri, jobs that Esri is hiring very much in a lot of different areas, right? So jobs that are currently available, so apply for those, but specifically focusing on the assistantships as well as the internships. And in the last year, so with internships, they have always been summer internships. Students apply for them. They go to Redlands, which is where the corporate office is, and they spend the summer there working on various teams. And it's usually, and very often that results in hire, obviously, if there's a fit, if there's a match, if there's joint interest and such. So that's a wonderful way to get a job, to get employment, and that applies to international, regardless of where the student is. Esri very much does sponsor international students. So those are a wonderful venue. Another one is the assistantships throughout various conferences, like UC in particular, and they've done it a couple of others. There's student assistantship programs where students go and help with the conference and set up and running some of the sessions and such. Now, sadly, last year, obviously because of COVID, and this upcoming year, that's not necessarily an opportunity, but hopefully when we're all back to normal, personal human interaction, we can actually attend some of these events. They are another wonderful opportunity to go into. So give me a second, I'll look it up real quick and I'll share that with in the chat. Otherwise, outside of Esri, obviously there's tons of GIS jobs and search engine and those kinds of sites that one could follow through. So let me go ahead and look this up. So hopefully that answered the question.
Do you think, are there any special considerations for international students? I think that was part of the question.
Not necessarily. Again, I mean, obviously English, but the key thing is that we welcome and we encourage diversity and as well as international students. And Esri does provide, again, if it's a temporary position, sponsorship post that. So that has been the case for as long as I've been employed by Esri. As to any other specific requirements pertaining to international students, I'm not really aware of any. I mean, students are students, right? So we welcome any and all diversity. So I'm going to put here in the meeting just some of the careers overview, and particularly there's a section there on student programs. I'm going to follow up with another link that outlines some of the assistantships as well as internships that I mentioned. And then just some of the overall student opportunities that are available, volunteering and so on and so on. So hopefully that helped answer the question. Okay, great.
So we have a hand raised.
Thanks. So sorry for another question. Maybe it's obvious that I'm also on the job hunt, so this is sort of front of mind. And Eric, maybe this is more of a question directed to you too. So in terms of, I think that creating a story map for a CV or resume seems really cool and a really awesome way to kind of showcase your skills visually for a future employer. Do you know if after we graduate and don't have access anymore through NC State, or does that stuff go away? Is that something that's still available that we could have on a website somewhere?
Do you want me to answer
you want
that?
to? Well, how about I start and I'll let you finish it, because ultimately you will be the determinant of that. So usually what we recommend in this case is, so as long as the application is shared with everyone, right? It is public, shared with everyone, even after you graduate, even after you cease to have access to the Arcgis online organization that NC State hosts, if it's public, you'll be able to see it. You'll be able to get access to it. You'll be able to share it. You're not going to be able to modify it or do much to it, but you'll still get access to it. And that's where maybe having some of that personal use account and transferring some of that, that's not the most trivial thing to transfer, but it's possible, right? Or recreating some of that could be a way to go. That way it's yours, you control, you can change it however you want to host it. So that's something to consider. Now the question, and that's more so in something that Eric and team can answer, is how long they keep content. We have always recommended, at least for some years, don't delete content in Arcgis. It's very dangerous to delete content, especially, could be content that's like your case, it's an actual application someone is using, could be content that research is depending on. Just be very careful how content is treated and how it's deleted. There's lots of storage and space and credits and such in Arcgis Online, so don't delete until you at least have some sort of a strategy. That is, the university has a strategy that has employed as to what should get deleted. Some universities are adopting strategies such as, if the content is not accessed in say 4 years or 3 years, then I'm going to delete it. If no one has clicked on that link, and there are tools, there are ways to figure that out, then obviously safe to delete. Or if it's not really truly active content, then anyway, so that's a little more involved. But the point of it is that's ultimately that's one thing we recommend: share it with everyone. As long as no one deletes it, you should still be able to access it. So that's it. Eric, back to you.
Yeah. So so at NC State, we're kind of in the process actually of sort of revising our rules for maintaining content after a student leaves. But I will say in general, we're essentially going to be following those recommendations, so that if you've made your story map version of your CV public, your account will not be the content in your account will not be removed in any near future. It would remain active and visible. But like Geri said, you may not have access to it to be able to update it without having to work through, moving it to whether it's a personal Esri account or another, Esri account that you may have in the future, and recreating it that way. But if you do create something and you want to continue to use it even after you've left NC State, then that will definitely be possible. So.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, and it looks like there's a question in the chat. Is it too late to apply for summer internships at Esri for 2021? Usually I believe they close in December, end of December of the prior year, obviously. But that's something to check. That deadline should be on the website. And usually it is December, so it might be a little bit late. But also it's always obviously worth asking, and you can send me a note. We can check with folks that are running that program. Or if there's an email there somewhere to simply inquire, is there still eligibility even though the deadline has passed, sort of thing. So hopefully that answers the question, but it's typically it's the December 31st.
So I'll ask one more question. So, going back to skill sets and, things that whether it's someone that's going to be a GIS professional or someone that's going to be a professional in another discipline and they have GIS as a tool, one thing that's kind of, come about in the last several years is, this term data science, right? And the ability to obviously analyze and visualize data. I mean, that's the core of GIS. But with sort of these new sort of data science paradigms, for lack of a better word, that are out there, and no one really knowing how to define it or what it really means and how is it different from things we've always done and things like that. I'm just curious, what's your take on the term data science, first of all, and then second, and maybe somewhat tangentially related, I'm just curious what Esri is maybe doing to continue to make connections to open source platforms. So thinking through the data science lens, thinking of like R and things like that. I'm just curious how, it's good to have that breadth of skill sets with open source and Esri and things, and just curious what Esri is doing to make interoperability more robust and efficient when thinking about connecting to open source programs, whether it's open source GIS or R or other things like that. So.
That's a great question, Eric, and it's kind of a couple of sides to it, right? So first, the data science. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then the open notion. So it's very interesting. I mean, with data science and this new paradigm, as you said, as you described it, the data science jobs are on the rise, right? So we all know that, and it's kind of a hype thing, and it's a hype thing to stay. It's been now a little bit hype for for quite some time, and there are a couple of different approaches, right? So in a sense, as geospatial professionals, it's almost like, to me, when we think about geospatial technology, we already are, in a sense, data scientists, right? We already are people that look at the data, that can understand the data, that can analyze the data, that can answer questions of the data, that can visualize that data. So in a sense, it's almost this convergence of, we call it GIS, or we call it geospatial tech with data science. To me, I consider ourselves geospatial data science or spatial data science professionals, right? So all of those opportunities that are out there, particularly some of them might highlight geospatial tech or have that as a component, and some of it is completely, unaware of GIS existence at all. But in a sense, we are data science professionals. We're spatial data science professionals. So that's sort of kind of my take on it. And of course, there are a lot of sort of typical data science workflows that are out there. And again, a lot of that, some of these analytical things that we've been doing them with GIS for quite some time. It's just sort of labeling them a little bit more in a different way, positioning them in a little bit. It's important to know, and it's important to understand that. And when we think about, again, GIS, geospatial technology, data science, I mean, it kind of all goes together, right? So I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And Esri, of course, has talked a lot about, especially in the last couple of years, a lot about data science and the data science methods and different data science methodologies that are out there and the technology that is there to use them, whether, again, when we speak about specific technologies, AI and machine learning, be able to do a lot of these analytical methods to be able to understand this data. And we've been able to do that for quite some time throughout various applications within Esri, whether it's, some in ArcGIS Pro, some in ArcGIS Online, some in Insights and such. So that's that. Now, in terms of the Esri Open, it's a very, very good question. And Esri also has made a lot of efforts in recent years to ensure integration with open technologies. And when we talk about open, there could mean a couple of different things, right? It can mean an actual open source, right? But it can actually also means integration with other platforms. So when we talk about this open vision, so there are, as obviously with some of the tools at Esri, they're locked, right? So they're not necessarily open, but many others, they are open. So they're open source. One can get the code about things, whether you're looking at some applications or story maps and such, or some of the underlying data, some of the APIs, so a lot of open data sort of notion there, as well as working with other standards and integrating with other technologies, particularly when we're talking about whether there's an R bridge integration, right? Whether there is some of the Python libraries, whether it's TensorFlow or some of these other ones, there is very close integration with those as well. So that's an important part to understand about the Esri sort of open vision and open approach. So I'm going to post something here in the chat just to take a look at and to peruse. So there's sort of an overview there, and there are a few initiatives like open integrations, there's developer APIs, like enterprise integrations and such. So there are quite a few different sort of notions there, standards and specifications, and again, open source, there are quite a few different things. Then you can kind of take a look at some of the drop downs there. When it comes to under initiatives, there's enterprise integrations, developer APIs, open data, standard specifications, open source, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of efforts towards that open interoperability, and especially with third-party companies, integration, if you will.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. Or no more questions?
There's a wonderful comment there for folks that are listening after. David Shore has a great definition: data scientist, either a programmer, better statistic, or statistician, better programming. It's a comment.
Okay, well, seems like there's no other questions. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Geri once again for presenting today. And as John posted in the link, there is a Zoom link for the GGSO sponsored post forum social. So if you want to hop on over there and join for just a casual discussion. All right. Well, thanks, Geri, and thank all of you for joining us.
All right, and thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure speaking to you, and for the wonderful questions. Thank you for those.
Great.
Thanks, Geri. Thanks, Eric.